Hi, and welcome everyone to the first ever Poverty and Race Live event, co-hosted by the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and the National Coalition on School Diversity. My name is Chen Lei, and I'm a professor of practice at the University of Virginia School of Law and a proud member of the PRRAC board. I'm thrilled to be moderating today's virtual panel. If you're not familiar with PRRAC or NCSD, PRRAC is a civil rights law and policy organization based in Washington, D.C., focused primarily on housing and education policy. Housed within PRRAC is NCSD, a cross-sector network of 50 plus national, state, and local organizations focused on school integration policy and advocacy. Today's PNR Live event is based on the latest issue of PRRAC's Poverty and Race Journal, The Interconnection Between School Finance and Segregation. Following our moderated discussion, we'll have time for audience questions, so be sure to send us your questions in the comments. Also, this event is being recorded. All right, without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our esteemed panelists who authored some of the pieces in the latest PNR Journal. Saba Beretta is co-founder of an exciting new organization, Brown's Promise, and is a former PRRAC staff member. Osamudia James is a professor of law at the University of North Carolina School of Law. Ann Owens is professor of sociology and spatial sciences at the University of Southern California and serves on PRRAC's Social Science Advisory Board. And finally, David Chiara is senior research fellow at the Learning Policy Institute and served as executive director of the Education Law Center from 1996 to 2003. Thank you all for joining me today. And perhaps let's get started with you, Osamudia. Your piece reminds us that a history of racial subordination informs the current public school funding system we've inherited, which is anchored in local control. Can you elaborate on that connection between local control and racism?
Absolutely. I'm so happy to be part of this conversation. And I think it's important to remember that often we tend to think about disparities in school funding as overlapping with racial segregation and racial hierarchy almost by chance. As the story goes, school segregation is the problem, and then the disparities that occur when students are isolated by race or class is just an unfortunate consequence. But I think the reality is that not only are school segregation and school finance inequality mutually constitutive, but that school finance inequality itself has historically been wielded as a tool of racial subordination. And it's anchored in this idea of communities being able to control what they have. So the notion of local control, the idea that local communities should control their own tax revenues for schools, was really only palatable, particularly in the South, because of racism. That is, prior to disenfranchisement, local school taxes were constitutionally prohibited or limited at the direction of the electorate in various states. And while wealthy landowners tended to oppose local school taxes, because they believed it was of limited benefit to them, middle-class white parents in particular opposed school taxes because they considered them to be a boon to Black residents who had less taxable wealth. Disenfranchisement, however, dampened opposition, right? After denying Black people access to voting and participation in many Southern states, state constitutions in Alabama, Louisiana, and North Carolina all amended their constitutions to permit the levy of school taxes, right? These places only wanted school taxes if they could ensure that Black people would have limited capacity to exercise any voice in how those funds were going to be used. States would further then use this control to further circumvent equal funding by trying to apportion the taxes paid by Black and white taxpayers. White local officials would often be given control over all the funds. Other localities would use the case value of Black students to fund white schools. So they received funds for the total number of students, and then they just simply withheld the share for Black students from Black communities and diverted them to white communities or white schools. At other times, still, claims of insufficient funds were used to close Black school communities or deny them capital investments. And then school integration doctrine works with this, making it impossible for states to reach across district lines to implement integration and school finance solutions. And so this means then that if we can't reach across district lines because local control is so paramount, White parents and or wealthier parents are incentivized to leave integrated districts for wealthier or all white districts, and they can't be reached there, right? And our doctrines ensure that. And when that happens, the state's capacity to try and reach the school revenues that are generated by the wealthier among us, and often generated by white people who are wealthy by virtue of racial hierarchy, the state's hands become tied. And ultimately, these practices and attitudes regarding funding persist today. This idea of local control persists today, and it helps to continue or to ensure that school finance is going to be a tool of racial subordination. So in integrated communities, for example, sometimes white taxpayers will leave the public school system for local private school entities, but then still exert disproportionate control over budgets, right? Sometimes voting down school bond measures that would improve the minority communities or the minority schools that they left behind for whiter private institutions. Nor is the problem fixed when you just ensure that the community is led by people from that community, right? So we're saying, oh, it's a Black district and they have some measure of control. We see even then that when, for example, Black communities manage to elect representatives to the board or to local government who can make better decisions in terms of school finance, those districts are often targeted for state takeovers, right? Allegations that they're misusing the money. And so this perverse way in which local control is used as a shield, and then it's used against minority communities. We let you have this money and see you weren't able to do what you needed to do with it. And so in this way, then school finance can be an affirmative and targeted tool of maintaining racial hierarchy. And it can be anchored in this idea of letting local communities control the money they have. When you overlay that with racial hierarchy in communities, what ends up happening is that school finance is withheld from some communities and distributed to others.
Let's stay on this issue of local control and financing of schools. And the reliance on local property taxes to fund schools is often pointed to as the biggest contributor to unequal educational opportunity. But yet, as you point out in your piece, increasingly progressive state spending over time has often closed the gaps in funding in some places. Can you explain why equal funding is not sufficient for equal opportunity or equal outcomes and the role that segregation plays in this?
Sure. Thank you, Chin. And I'm happy to be here today to discuss my fellow panelists' great essays. And I just want to amplify what Osamudio was just saying and thank her for pointing out, the multifaceted problem of local control. It's not just a property tax issue. I think she makes a really compelling point in her essay about how local control is this tool of racial exclusion. So I think to start, I just want to, confirm that school funding matters, right, for a range of impacts. There has been debate about this. I'm really compelled by the work of Kira Bo Jackson and colleagues and others. So when we talk about school finance and school funding, this is really important. This does matter for a range of children's impacts. And what I was trying to engage in my essay was that, commentary about segregation and school funding typically concludes that because public schools are funded in part by local property taxes, and because district lines create distinct and unequal communities in terms of that property tax base, white and higher income children's schools have much more funding than Black, Latinx, other students of color, and lower income children's schools. But I think, this is an oversimplification, right? Because school finance reform since the 1970s has reduced a lot of these funding disparities through state and federal school policies. So if you look on average, there actually aren't large disparities in total per pupil expenditures in the schools of students of different racial ethnic groups or different economic backgrounds. And of course, averages hide extremes, and there are places where state and federal funding have not, offset local inequalities. Saba gives a great example in her essay. And we also need to guard against reversals of this progress we've made from school finance reform. So there's evidence from Erica Weathers and Victoria Cecina's work that as racial segregation increases, funding progressivity, where Black children's schools are actually funded at higher levels, declines. Some of my own work with Kendra Bischoff shows that school spending became, less progressive towards low-income students districts during the Great Recession after 2007. So it's absolutely important to continue to do careful empirical analyses to understand the relationship between segregation and funding, where, under what circumstances do large gaps persist. But I think what I was trying to turn the conversation to, and what I would like to emphasize, is that it's important to not just look at whether or not funding is equal, because in many places, Black and white children or higher and lower income children's schools have fairly equal funding, and sort of stopping there, but to instead think about, well, what does equitable funding look like, right? And so let me be clear, segregation, absolutely creates inequity in educational opportunities and outcomes. This is what I spend the majority of my time in my academic work trying to provide actionable evidence about. But rather than being equal, school funding has to be progressive, right? We should be providing more resources to the students who need them in order to produce the same outcomes on a range of outcomes, not just test scores, as more advantaged students. And segregation contributes to challenges around equity because a dollar goes less far in schools of concentrated poverty with, highly segregated schools. So, the challenge then, I think, is figuring out, well, how much more progressive should funding be? How much more should funding be in the schools of disadvantaged students? And that's where I think there's really important work happening in both research and advocacy and school finance reform, advocating for funding that allows students from all backgrounds to succeed at the same standards, regardless of their racial, ethnic, or economic background. So I think, what I was trying to engage in my essay was, first, school funding matters. Second, segregation absolutely creates very different educational conditions for students from different racial, ethnic, and economic groups. And three, we need to emphasize thinking about what equitable, not equal funding means. So I'll wrap up there.
Saba, I know that Anne invoked you. I don't know if you have an initial response, although I have a question for you too, or David, or Osamudio for that matter.
Sure. Thank you, both Anne and Osamundia, for the great topics. I think I would just add, when we talk about kind of the challenges that segregated schools face that may not be fully addressed by even achieving, equal funding. One example is teachers, right? We know that segregated schools serving high numbers of kids living in poverty have difficulty attracting experienced and effective teachers. In my opinion, this is, largely attributed to negative stereotypes that people might have about kids at schools and living in concentrated poverty and the communities in which those schools are located. But regardless of the reason, it's difficult for those schools to recruit and retain excellent teachers. So they experience teacher churn, and they often have to turn to hiring high numbers of novice teachers. So that's one example. I would also add, for example, exclusionary discipline to that list, and a lack of access to rigorous coursework. So I think we have to think beyond just the dollars, as Anne's been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we hear from David, I'll just say, yes, what the money is being spent on also differs, drastically between schools of different students, and, attracting and retaining teachers through salaries, and also things like, capital improvement and other sort of basic needs that might be more predominant in students, lower income or racially minoritized student schools than more economically advantaged or white student schools.
So Anne, I want to ask you a question. We know that legally states control the level of funding that their districts receive, the use of funding, and the revenue mix, right? The mix between state and local revenue, which you indicate is particularly important to get to some measure of progressivity. And you also recognize that, in effect, poor kids in segregated districts need more because of the concentration of student need is so great in those districts that the level of resources, the funding and resources, teachers and support staff, and all of that are needed is much greater, and they need actually higher levels of funding than kids in more affluent districts. So my question for you is, you talk about some states actually achieving that kind of progressivity. How did they do it, and what was sort of the revenue mix that they wound up with getting there to avoid the problem of not just as you correctly point out, using property taxes as part of the mix, but the over-reliance on property taxes that either creates level funding or disparate funding?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think that I invite my co-panelists who may be more knowledgeable to weigh in as well. I think that in many states, there are weighting formulas that sort of purposely, recognize the need to provide more resources to students that may need them more. Those weights and sort of that level of progressivity varies a lot in states. I always refer people to Bruce Baker's great work on this, where he sort of breaks it down state by state and sort of shows which states are hitting this and which are not. So I don't have great examples off the top of my head, David, but I think that it's about sort of states recognizing the need to provide more funding in certain groups of student schools, and then factoring that in, whether it's a weighting formula or something else, into their state finance policy. But I invite my co-panelists to chime in as well.
I just wanted to raise two issues I do think complicate this. I don't have perfect examples either, although I think Anna's right that this is about the weighting formulas and thinking about adequacy. What does a community need to get them up to a particular level or to allow them to have the same opportunities as others? I think two things that complicate this is really the existence of the integrative ideal. Like Anne, most of my work is committed to that as an ideal. So I think some of the funding issues can be addressed if schools are not so isolated. So the problem attracting teachers is a function of isolation. And the funding disparities is a function of isolation. At the same time, right, there is this ongoing concern about what communities lose, who's losing when we're integrating, and who's being integrated into. And I don't have an answer here, but thinking about what are the ways in which we can, and I think funding formulas do some of this work, investing in communities where they are and understanding that those communities are valuable and have things to contribute and have norms and conventions that are important, and that even if an area cannot be integrated, those students deserve to have the opportunities that other students have to achieve to the best of their capacity. And so that's one issue. I don't know if my co-panelists have thoughts about that. The second issue is about equalization formulas leveling the bottom, but no capacity to restrict the top, right? And so if it's one thing that middle class and upper and wealthier parents are good at, it's about finding some way to use advantage. And our limited capacity to put a limit on that. What do you do when a PTA comes in with extra funds, right? Or a community wants to fundraise independently and throw that money at schools. And I think it's a tough topic, but I've often thought there should be ways to rein that in as well. I don't know what that looks like. I'm a lawyer. I don't know what that looks like, but there's something there about the arms race that happens and the ways in which we keep creating this gap. Although I do firmly believe that if we really committed to adequacy, it might matter less, right, what people at the very top are doing, because everyone would have what they need to be as successful as possible.
I think people often see this as a dichotomy of sort of, or a question of, well, why can't we just have great schools everywhere for every student? And I think all of us, that would be amazing. That's what we all want, right? And I think there's often this dichotomy of sort of, do we move people, children, or do we move resources? And you're absolutely right. Who has to move? The burden of that is historically placed on Black students and other students of color and disadvantaged students. And I don't think that is what we should be advocating for. And everyone has, I would like everyone to have access to a great local school. So I think, I'm trying to move away from thinking about that as a dichotomy of we do one or the other. I don't think we have, examples in a society that continues to operate under a system of, structural racism. Like I don't think anyone's like jumping in line to, dramatically move resources. So I think we need to do both. And I think they work in lockstep, right? So if we integrate that equalizes or creates equitable school funding, and then that, schools become less different, and so people are able to all have access to a high quality school, and it sort of works. I think about it working in a cycle, and I think we need to do both. And I know other folks want to jump in, so I'll stop there, but your second point, absolutely as well.
Yeah, I'll just add, I really love that, the integrative ideal, and I think we all really need to sit and think about what exactly we're envisioning when we say that. And I don't think it is, right, a model where we are only pushing Black and brown kids out to white and wealthy suburbs. I think we can be more creative and imaginative than that. And I think we see places that are trying to do that. I'll shout out Hartford and their system of regional magnets. But I really think we have to really concentrate on the student experience in this integrative ideal that you're talking about. And that means having teachers of diverse backgrounds, right? Like that we remember that we have to have a diverse teaching staff in an integrated school, that we have the supports that those teachers need to be able to teach all students, so to be culturally competent with all students, to not be dependent on exclusionary discipline, which means attacking, teachers' bias. I mean, there's just many elements to integrative ideal school that I think we have to take the time to really think through and provide the policy supports to make that happen.
You all are a moderators panel that everyone hopes for. I love this conversation, and I'm going to stay with you, Saba, because we've invoked the integrative ideal. We've invoked the issue of taxes and structure of schools, and my understanding of your piece is that you're talking about how we can't address these issues of inequity in silos, right? So what is the connection between local property taxes, school district boundaries, school segregation that you think we need to understand to realize Brown's promise?
For that. So yeah, I think everybody on this call can immediately think of a school district in their state serving high numbers of students of color and students living in poverty, and they can think of a district that's right next door or close by, that's often wealthier and often whiter. Philadelphia and the mainline districts, Brookline and Boston, Detroit and Grosse Pointe, right? Like these are examples that we can find in most states. And under our system of school districts and student assignment, public school students typically have no choice but to attend the schools in their district. And so I'll just give you an example of how those boundaries then operate to segregate students from resources. So in our piece, we talk about two districts in Georgia, just south of Atlanta, Clayton County and Fayette County public schools. And I want to make sure before I keep going, I co-wrote our piece with my co-founder, Ari Amerikaner, who was a whiz at maps and really the source of a lot of this great information. These two districts are right next to each other. Pre-pandemic data shows that Clayton County had a 24% poverty rate, and its student population was 98% Black and Latino. The district's median property value was $98,000. Meanwhile, again, next door, Fayette County had only a 6% poverty rate pre-pandemic, and a student population that is significantly has significantly less minority students, so 54% non-white, and had a median property value nearly 3 times that of Clayton County, so at $270,000. So right there, we're going to see the difference in the ability of those two districts to raise money from local property taxes. And so in a state where roughly 50, in this is Georgia, in a state where 50% of funding is coming from local property taxes, you can imagine right there, Clayton is starting off with far, far less money. And so any attempt for the state to make up that gap, to kind of redistribute funds, any attempt they are trying is falling short here, because even with the state money included that I mentioned, Clayton is spending significantly less than Fayette, even though Clayton is serving students with 4 times the level of poverty. And so the difference in funding really manifests in real difference in resources offered in those two neighboring districts again. So one example, which I've already mentioned around teachers, Clayton has a nearly all Black and Hispanic student population, and they are exposed to novice teachers at a rate 5 times that in their peers in Fayette County. So we have a district with high needs, high numbers of students in poverty, getting served by our least experienced teachers. So we really, as we say in the piece, we think without actually attacking those borders, leaders in Georgia and other states are going to continue to struggle to achieve educational equity One, for the reason that I mentioned before, that there are problems that even after funding reform we see continue in schools of concentrated poverty, like the ability to attract our most experienced and effective teachers. It's more expensive, as Anne just talked about, to sufficiently fund these schools. And in a system like Georgia's, where it's largely funded by property taxes, it requires a substantial amount of redistribution of money to make sure that a high poverty district has what it needs. And that's politically unpopular. In many states just doesn't happen, untenable, right? And so we think that we really need to start thinking about, of course, continuing to advocate for as much funding as possible for kids who need it, but also thinking about why do we view these districts as, these district lines as kind of sacrosanct, that like they are not. They're movable, they can be porous, and we should be attacking those districts to make sure that kids are no longer being separated from resources.
I just want to emphasize the importance of school district boundaries and school district lines in creating inequality. So with my co-founder, Sean Reardon, we run the Segregation Index, which will produce data on segregation, both in terms of residential and school segregation. And in a brief we put out last year, we note that the majority of school segregation in the United States is due to segregation between school districts, right? So school segregation is high because students of color attend districts, where white students are also not enrolling in high numbers. So about 80% of racial segregation is occurring between school districts. And when I'm doing my data work, a fact that always sticks with me is, in the US, we have about 13,000 school districts nationwide. 90% of students of color attend school in just about 15% of those districts. So 85% of districts have, almost no students of color. And so again, the between district story is huge here, both in terms of segregation and obviously school finance as well. So just wanted to note that these school district boundaries are really, really a source of stratification.
I want to note that unfortunately law helps bolster all of this. The idea that, and the court pretends or has pretended in our school desegregation cases that district lines are not creatures of the state, but of course they're created by the state. Sometimes they're intentionally placed in particular places to foster segregation, and it can be used to foster integration. But this idea that people naturally live in places and naturally go to schools and places that just lead to isolation is just not true. And it's really important to remind people of that. It's not who's here and who is not here, and that is all constructed, right? Those are all often the product of state action. And the state has a lot of power to change that. And district lines is one place where if you can make some movement there in terms of the doctrine, you can make some progress.
It's almost like you were anticipating the question I was going to ask, Osamudia, because I was going to turn to David. Your piece kind of pulls a lot of this together and focuses on interrelated groups of state policies that reinforce some of the existing inequities that we see. What are these state level obstacles to achieving more equitable and diverse public schools?
So thank you, Chin. Let me just start out by reminding, we have to remind ourselves always that the states control our public education systems by virtue of their constitutions, right? All state constitutions mandate that states affirmatively maintain and support a system of free public education. And as you've been hearing, the most predominant land feature on the American education landscape in our state systems is segregation, right? The segregation of low-income students, Black and brown students, intense concentration of those students along district boundary lines. And I can't emphasize enough this is 70, 80 years going back, the harm to generations of students as a result of this, right? And it's two sets of harms, really. It's, as you've been hearing, the harm to Black and brown and low-income students who are consigned to districts that have less resources, less ability to give them the opportunities that they need to achieve and be successful. On the the other harm is to all kids, especially today in the rapidly diversifying society that we have today in the U.S. You know, all kids, white kids, black and brown kids, Asian kids, suffer when there's no opportunity for them to attend schools that are socioeconomically and racially diverse, and ethnically diverse. That's the society that they're going to be entering into today. And part and parcel, I would argue, of a public education has to be preparing kids for that diverse society, economy, democracy that they're going to be entering when they graduate. So I really want to emphasize those 2 points. But the other point is that because the states control the system, and I think this is, Asmudia was picking up on this, the states cause these harms, right? The states, and they do it through 2 sets of policies. One is the way they draw district boundaries, and the second is their broken finance systems that don't deliver enough state and local funding to ensure that students in segregated districts have the resources that they need to meet state academic standards. But then the point is that since the states cause these harms through their policies, they can fix it. And I think Asmudia was really talking about that, which was super important. There's 2 things that I argue that we need to focus in on. One is we have to make sure that kids, even if they're now consigned to segregated districts, get everything they need today to succeed. They only get one opportunity to attend school in their lifetime. And even if they're in districts that are segregated by poverty and race, they're entitled to that progressive school finance system that Ann was talking about. They're entitled to all of the resources that they need in order to meet the very state standards that the states are prescribing that they meet. So that's sort of the equity piece. The other part is the diversity piece. States can fix the way district boundaries are drawn, and they can create more opportunities, even in a legal setting where we're limited to some extent around the issue of de facto segregation. There are a number of things that we know they can do in order to create more opportunities for all students to have the opportunity to an education in a diverse classroom, a diverse learning environment. They can redraw district boundaries. They can do public school choice programs, the magnet program that Hartford is doing. They can outlaw district successions that cause more segregation. They can prevent segregation by charter schools. I could go on, but there's a number of policy fixes that states can do. And the last point I'm going to make is going to lead into the next conversation I think we're going to have, Chin, which is about advocacy. We need to kind of rethink our advocacy movements at the state level to focus on this twin set of policies, making sure kids get what they need today and moving towards diversity in our schools, and rethinking all of that and building strong political movements in state houses that seek to effectuate what I would argue is the right of all children to a public education in the 21st century, which is a right to attend schools that are both well-resourced, even if they serve high concentrations of kids of color, of socioeconomic, of low-income kids today, but also are diverse. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. So I see some great questions already popping up in the comments, and I know we're excited to get to them. Thank you all for those and keep them coming. I guess I'd like to just pose this last one to all of you, whoever wants to answer first or in any order. But from your respective vantage points, what are those specific changes in policy or practice that David was just talking about that are needed to bring about truly equitable and diverse schools at a systemic level? What would you like to see people organizing around?
So Chin, let me just start off on the equity side. I mean, I mentioned some things on diversity or integration, if you want to, however you want to think about that. But on the equity side, there's, to me, having worked on this for a long time in states, there's sort of 3 things that we need to do to make sure that kids, even if they're in segregated districts, get what they need. The first is what Ann was talking about. We need cost-based weighted student funding formulas that really deliver more resources as concentrated poverty, as segregation increases, at levels that ensure that the teachers, support staff, the things that Saba was talking about are the opportunity for those are available in those districts today for those kids. The other, I would argue, is universal preschool. That is absolutely essential. We've got to make sure that at the very least, if you're in a segregated district in the United States, you should have access at 3 and 4 to well-planned, high-quality preschool starting at age 3, tied to K-12. And the last thing that we always sort of leave out are building improvements. Our buildings are falling apart in these districts all over the country. That's a state responsibility. In so many states, there are states that literally do nothing in the way of providing financial support to high poverty, high taxed, segregated communities in order to bring their buildings into the 21st century, have the air conditioning and the adequacy and all that they need. So 3 building blocks: weighted student funding, universal pre-K, and adequate and financing for capital improvements over the long haul.
I think everyone can probably guess my answer. A more regional approach to education, student assignment across districts, revenue pooling across districts, consolidations that are intended to increase integration. We want to see policymakers and advocates bringing attention to the continued persistence of school segregation and therefore the continued persistence of resource inequities in this country. We cannot continue to have generations of kids that are kept from the resources that other kids have. Like, that is not the promise that Brown was intended. That's not what we're supposed to have in this country. And we fundamentally, I don't think, want generations of students who have never gone to school with kids that don't look like them. Like, that is not a healthy foundation for our democracy. As Derek Black, one of our advisory board members, has said, we have to denormalize school district lines. Asamundia pointed to the fact these are creatures of state policy. There's nothing magical or untouchable about them. We can change them, and we can start working to build schools that are socioeconomically and racially diverse, safe, welcoming environments for all kids.
I'll introduce to our conversation something that's been looming in the background, which is the relationship between residential and school segregation. So I think often, people think about the ways that residential segregation is reflected in school segregation. I always think about it as a bidirectional relationship. School segregation also then contributes to residential segregation because parents are choosing to live in certain districts. So I'd encourage us, also, in addition to the great suggestions by my co-panelists, to think about both housing policy and school policy, and especially how they work together, right? So think about how would, zoning reform make the biggest impact on school segregation by being attentive to how zoning and school district boundaries map onto one another. How do we get affordable housing in high income districts and in high income neighborhoods? And I just think it's important, to get the maximum impact out of our policies, to think about how housing and education policies interact with one another, right? So housing or residential integration will have limited impact on school segregation if unfettered choice exists and parents kind of opt out of local schools if they're serving a more diverse mix of students, which evidence shows happens. So I think that when we're thinking about solutions, we need to think about housing and school policy jointly.
As a lawyer, I think I'm always going to be thinking about doctrine to some extent. I think it's easy to think that this is a lost cause, some of the precedents on how we think about what is discrimination, when is it intentional, whether district lines are inviolable. But I do think that we have to continue fighting in these areas because things change, court compositions change, judges change, and we have to preserve a commitment to this for the future. And the second thing I would say is voting. I think there's a way in which, even though people get on board and want changes, things like gerrymandering and voter disenfranchisement make it so that when we come together and want to express a preference for policy, we are blocked from doing that. And so I do think this is linked to larger issues about access to democracy, and that work has to happen at the same time that we are developing better policies for our schools at a local or regional level.
Thank you all. I'm going to turn to some of the questions we've been getting. And there's one expressing concern about the fact that if we don't view school district lines as permanent, then we may get more school district secession than consolidation, or the opposite option is uncontrolled choice. And New Orleans was presented as an example of that. So who wants to take that on?
Jen, I mean, on the issue of successions, look, it goes back to state policy. We have, states allow these successions through the laws that they enact. And we do have states that prohibit successions. There are states where successions are not, have to be approved by state officials, and they can't exacerbate segregation. My point on successions is it's sort of the larger point that Saba was talking about in terms of advancing integration and diversity. There are we know what to do. There are specific policies that states could enact tomorrow to begin to reverse course, to start to move us away from the intensely segregated school systems that we currently have today, to create systems that have more opportunity for students to attend diverse schools. And one of the things has to be to prohibit things like successions, which exacerbate already intense patterns of school segregation. States can do it, but it's back to the question of the political will in the state capital to get state legislatures and governors to do that. That's a huge task that's on our collective plate.
Anyone else want to hop in on this one?
I think David did a great job. I guess I'll just clarify, like, completely understand, like, we need, a system of governance for our schools. And so I don't think I'm saying, like, we should not have school districts. I am saying that those school districts can be redrawn just the same way that we redraw congressional districts and redraw all kinds of districts. We can redraw them with the express purpose of creating more integrated schools.
I think the question also raised this issue about succession and school choice. And I do want to highlight the position in which parents are often placed. The state abdicates its responsibility for education. It steps out of that space and then creates sort of like school markets in which parents are asked to choose, right? We have to succeed. We have to pick a charter school. We have to go pick someplace else. And the risk is shifted from the state to parents. And the state can then say, well, we made options available for you. And if you chose, you just sort of chose incorrectly. And I just want to highlight that because education is a state responsibility. And there's a way in which we have normalized the idea that we are going to place all that responsibility for making sure you choose the right school on parents, as opposed to making sure that all the school options are good ones and parents don't have to feel like I have to camp out to enter a lottery or I have to apply to this school. Or I mean, it's a really corrosive application of sort of market mentality to a public good like education. And I want to put it out there because it can be easy to villainize parents for making all these choices and leaving, but there's a way in which parents have come to understand that they are the only ones responsible for making sure that education turns out right. And that's not correct.
That's just a thought-provoking and really great, poignant point you're making. I want to turn to a question by another person who's checking in, who asks about the opportunities for leveraging housing policy, such as the possibility of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule to promote more equitable outcomes in schools and in communities. Anyone want to take that one on?
I can start and say a little bit more. I appreciate, first of all, I just have to say, Osamudia, what a powerful framing of sort of states abdicating responsibility. I'm really going to grapple with that. So thank you for that provocative, absolutely correct framing. But on this question about housing and thinking about housing policy and the potential of something like AFFH to promote equitable outcomes. Yeah, I think, I'd love to see as jurisdictions and states are putting together their plans around AFFH, a lot of them are looking at data about different regions and subregions of their areas to try to figure out kind of housing needs and how to allocate housing affordability, and to do so in ways that provide opportunity. So one thing I've been thinking a lot about is how educational data and measures of schooling are sort of part of this ecosystem. So, for example, I'm doing a lot of work right now on the low-income housing tax credit program, and every state now has language in their regulations around providing affordable housing in high resource or high opportunity areas. And often education is part of that. Some measure of school quality is put into those metrics. And I'm using quotes a lot because I think that, we need to really interrogate, well, how are we, how are we identifying and measuring opportunity? What are the different ways that states are doing that? So I do think that there's potential here. I mean, states have to figure out ways to advance housing goals in ways that do not perpetuate segregation. Of course, there's always this tension between, on the one hand, providing affordable housing in high poverty areas that need that, and on the other hand, allowing people, the options to move to other places if they would so desire. Going back to sort of the same parallel conversation about, do we move resources or do we move kids? Same thing here. Do we invest in historically disinvested neighborhoods, or do we sort of allow people to move to opportunity? So all that to say, I think there is potential, and I think it's really important to think about how we measure educational features and put those into policy.
Fair housing laws, they're really only as useful as the people enforcing them, right? And so some administrations and some departments will do aggressive work here, and others won't. And so there's a way in which, again, going back to this question of how do we give people the capacity to voice their concerns and put into power people who are going to enforce their priorities, because it really matters what administration is looking at fair housing laws. It really matters what administrations are thinking about what states are doing and investigating them and holding them to account. Other than that, I think Anne perfectly summarized what the potential is here, and also what some of the tensions are about where we put our investments, and the extent to which we want to invest in communities, but also give people freedom and liberty to go to places that might be better fits for them and their families.
All right, I see one just coming in here saying that they'd love to hear more about how close we've come to funding equality and some of those earlier topics. Is that Anne? Should you take that one?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. So this is a great point. And, reading back through my essay, I wish I had given some pithier statistics about this. So you're exactly, I think, on the right track. And I'm happy to follow up with you as well. But yeah, I think that, I think that, Bruce Baker and others provide some good context on this. I think I'm always careful to think about how funding looks when we're considering all sources, so local, state, and national. I have some papers that I cite in my essay for the most recent journal that provide some information and showing how it varies by segregation levels. But yeah, if you want sort of a statistic about, the prevalence of gaps, I would have to get back to you on that, but it's an empirical analysis that's easily done using the publicly available data, either through the Common Core or through Bruce's data that he puts out on school finances. So it's a punt, but I don't have the statistics at my fingertips.
Chin, I can comment on. There are not a lot of states that. Most of our financing systems still in our states are old school, dollar-driven, politically driven exercises. Right? It's what we're willing to spend, politically. They're not grounded in determinations of cost, of education cost. Including the cost of achieving certain outcomes. And We know how to do cost-based weighted student funding formulas. There are states that have them, but it's a political challenge to get, especially today in many of the states where you have state legislatures and governors that are, frankly hostile to public education and are doing everything that they can now to undermine our public schools through the rapid expansion of private school vouchers and other ways of privatization. It's hard to get these states to live up to that, but we do know how to do it. I think a huge challenge is, and we have states that are examples of that, but a huge challenge is building the political will, and it goes back to voting with an eye towards voting legislators in who are pro-public education, who are willing to step up, who are willing to pass broad-based state taxes increases, for example, and direct those taxes to the communities and districts that need them the most. That's a challenge. We do have some good examples. I would lift up Kansas as a great example of a state where folks are really organized and have been for a long time around high equity across the state and have really beaten back, if you will, the forces of privatization, and in the process have built a public education financing system that really is grounded in determinations of what it costs to educate children across the state.
So we had one just come in from Nancy about the future Supreme Court rulings around the possibility of limiting integration in the K-12 context. It's one that I'm sure we all have thoughts and opinions on, but I don't know who wants to take it.
I'm happy to start there. I actually do have concerns. And this issue is not necessarily, it's really the issue of sort of how do we think about diversity in schools and whether we should be thinking about race at all, and the ways in which schools have been asked for years not to think about diversity, right? The court never said it was something that would justify thinking about race in school placements. The court never gave us opportunity to do that. And now with the recent ruling about higher ed, I think it's become more explicit that schools shouldn't. I do have concerns, however, to the extent that integration is one way in which we deal with finance inequality. Schools are thinking about how do we make sure, especially if it's like a selective public school or a school with limited seats, how do we make sure that we have diversity in terms of enrollment at the school? And I'm watching cases that are moving through sort of the lower districts and lower circuits about what schools are doing in the alternative. I'm looking in particular at Thomas Jefferson High School, which was a school that a very selective public high school that completely redid its admissions process to not consider race, but made it more selective in some ways, more emphasis on GPA, on grades, add an interview, I think added some sort of service requirement. But the school board at some point went on record as saying it would be nice for our school to reflect our community. And they were sued for that, saying that this was an impermissible consideration of race. It was struck down at the Fourth Circuit level, but of course it's going to be appealed. And I'm very concerned about how the court may expand notions of intent and thinking about race and accusing institutions of using class as a proxy for race, and how districts are going to be able to defend themselves against those claims, and how perverse it is that districts and school boards and institutions should not be able to think about racial diversity as a good thing, right? If there's any sign that they're doing that, they may be opening themselves up to liability. So I'll leave it there, but I am concerned. I'm not necessarily optimistic about this.
Just add quickly, I do want to kind of emphasize that the decision was very specifically about the use of race in admissions in higher education. And I think many of us were happy to see that it did not explicitly address K-12 efforts. And so I think many of us would like to continue to see districts operate under the existing PICS decision that we've got, the space that was left there for K-12 schools to consider diversity. And so, I think it's important that, especially at the highest levels of our government, the Biden administration, superintendents, state superintendents continue to say, that school districts should operate within the legal confines that they can to be pursuing diversity. And I think Thomas Jefferson took a lot of time and effort to try to create a system that was actually race neutral, that actually had some was able to recruit more kids of color and low income kids into that school. And so I was happy to see the Fourth Circuit said, like, this was a race neutral plan that we're not gonna touch. But I share your concerns about what the Supreme Court might do with it. But I do think we should all, remember that this specific decision was very specific to higher ed and admissions, even though we are seeing it have repercussions beyond that.
Yeah, I would follow up on that. There's sort of three quick points. One is we've got to hold on to Seattle-Louisville. Seattle-Louisville does allow states to address de facto, and districts to, not just states, but also districts to address de facto segregation by drawing district boundary lines, citing schools, the whole list. Obviously, the court doesn't allow assignment of individual school children based on their race. But other than that, there's a lot of room for the kinds of policies that we've been talking about for states and local school districts to implement to create diversity. The second thing is around the states. We only have 3 state high courts that have actually ruled that their constitutional right to education in their state constitution includes the prohibition against racial imbalance in the schools and the promotion of diversity. Connecticut, New Jersey, and Minnesota. We've got to start to build that kind of movement towards getting states in other states to starting to conceptualize the right to education K-12 and their obligation to operate these systems to address racial imbalance and advance diversity. And the third point I'd make is, we're in a very different, in terms of diversity, we're in a very different place in the United States today and going forward than we were 50, 70 years ago. We're about to be, very close to, majority citizens of color. The diversity in our country is just expanding constantly. And so we have to sort of embed in the very notion of what it is to get a public education, that opportunity to be exposed to children of other races, other cultures, other classes, if you will, to prepare. Why? That's essential for preparing kids to enter the workforce, to go to college, to higher education, and so forth and so on. So we have to start talking about that as an affirmative part of public education. And the last thing I think we need to do is, this is a call for the unification amongst all of us, of those who are working on the integration side, the desegregation side, and those working on the sort of equity side, on school finance equity and all. People have to come together around a broader notion of what we need for public education today that includes both equity, adequacy, and diversity.
I wanted to talk really before we end about PICS. I think the Seattle and Louisville cases, I think we want to, it's not, the court, when the court thought diversity, when the court was telling us diversity was okay, it was limited to higher education. And the Supreme Court specifically declined to find it as a compelling interest at the K-12 level. And so to the extent that schools can think, or districts can think about race, that decision just said that you could not use race as a factor in making assignments. And then Kennedy writes sort of an in-between decision saying schools can think about this in race neutral ways. But there is this gap in terms of whether diversity is a value there. The court never declined to affirm it as a value there. And increasingly, this court is hostile to even race neutral remedies if they think that there's evidence of some sort of discrimination. And this raises some of the issues we saw in higher ed about who's being discriminated against and the ways in which this is starting to pit minoritized groups against each other. So I think there's a lot to watch here, to be optimistic about also, but also to be wary about where this is going. It's not clear to me that we have good precedent on thinking about diversity at K-12 at all.
Well, the fact that this is such an interesting topic just suggests that we should get together again and do this very soon. But it looks like we're out of time. So thank you all for joining me for this very lively discussion. And thank you for all those of you who submitted questions. They were great. As a reminder, the recording of this event is available on PRRAC's YouTube and Facebook pages. Be sure to check out the latest issue of Poverty and Race, the interconnection between school finance and segregation, on PRRAC's website, PRRAC.org. And we hope to see you at a future PNR Live event. Thanks again, and thank you, panelists.